Thank you very much. This presentation, I'm going to tell it as the story, as my kind of transition and journey through my career. So I thought that would be maybe the most relatable way that you can kind of understand the journey that I've been on. So I started out my career as an engineer. I trained at the University of Cambridge, and my first job was designing this car here. It was a Jaguar's first electric vehicle. And so I was really immersed in this incredibly high-tech world of reductionism, simplifying everything we could into an equation to try and create the most efficient vehicle possible. And so we were a team of 300 engineers locked in a remote building in total skunk works. And for 5 years, we designed this. And at the end of all of that, it had about the same life cycle impact as a normal diesel car. So wasn't quite planned. My next project was this. We started designing recyclable footwear. And the technology was great, except had one fundamental flaw. No one ever actually bothered to recycle the shoe. So again, the human was, it was a little bit of a flawed project. And I think the thing that's kept coming up for me in my career is this phrase of the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And this here is, in fact, does anyone know what a mopis is? So it's the first ever plastic that was invented in the 1800s. And it was a plastic that was invented to replace ivory. And so ivory, instead of using elephant tusks, and this plastic meant you could have wonderful cutlery that were just like ivory, and it was obviously much more affordable, much more accessible. It didn't harm wildlife in the process. Obviously, an amazing innovation, but the reality is that something was intended to be good, and I'm very aware that I'm not aware of anything that was not built without a good intention in mind that has now started to cause problems. And so I think, we need to be very careful when we're pursuing these innovations. Yes, we might have a good intention in mind, but what are the potential negative consequences that might come from that? And so I was very aware of the negative consequences of the projects I've been working on. And this very simple thought experiment kind of really struck me, which was I just asked, could we ever engineer anything as beautiful or as elegant as a tree? And the answer was no. There's no way we could replicate that. We'd have pumps and solar panels and wires and all sorts of things going on. And so I started to start working with nature. And then a second kind of thought experiment was really instrumental in my thinking, which was if we divided up our planet between everyone who lived on it, each of us would be a custodian or a resident of a small portion of land. And it turns out, the calculations that size of that land, it would be 2 football pitches of land, but it would be about 40 swimming pools worth of ocean. And I found this a really interesting mental model for kind of how to think about stewardship and the trade-offs and the choices that we're making on a day-to-day basis. And I got so obsessed with this idea that I actually found an island that was exactly the right size for one person. So this is an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And we sailed out there and went to visit the island. And the thing that, it was actually a lot shorter trip than we expected, because when we got there, what we really realized very, very quickly was that the most interesting thing wasn't the land here. The most interesting thing was the ocean. The ocean compared to the land was so abundant and so rich. And so I started to really get fascinated by that. And while we were on this journey, we met some researchers. So around here in French Polynesia, it's very well known in the field of bioprospecting. So bioprospecting is when you go out and you start looking for these really unique, interesting microorganisms. And it's a field kind of some people call biological dark matter, because for every one microorganism we know, people estimate there are about 100,000 that we don't know. So there's this huge world of unknown biological capability. And within that, there may be new vaccines, new anti-cancer drugs, new kind of formations of materials we could never even have possibly thought of. And I got very, very excited by this. And so I stayed out there. I started to really, understand kind of all the science going on in this area, but also understand, what's going on with the indigenous communities. And there was this big difference between how the scientific community would approach looking for these microorganisms and the local community would approach it. And when I found myself kind of running around with test tubes, trying to kind of capture samples and find these microorganisms, I realized I was kind of undertaking a very colonial activity as this white dude going to try and steal these microorganisms from this island. And so tried to flip it on its head. And so this was the project that came out of it. It was called Lucid Life, and it's an island called Moorea in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's an incredible community. There's about 10,000 people who live on the island, and it's about kind of 15 kilometers by 20 kilometers. So it's kind of the perfect size island to really just understand how ecosystems work. And so one of the organisms on the island is bioluminescent microalgae. And we started to play with the idea of what material could we make with this? And we came up with the idea of this bioluminescent material, and the local people loved it. So we came back to London and worked with the Francis Crick Institute in London and actually managed to kind of make this material a reality. This idea of encapsulating bioluminescent microalgae, putting it into a textile-like material. And then we worked with the local community to kind of create these artifacts from that. And you could see some of the artifacts in that video. One of them was a swimsuit. So a lot of people there fish at night, and so the idea was kind of go and protect them. So someone designed a swimsuit that you can see there. You also saw a drum, you saw a necklace. We made a whole collection of objects with the local creatives. And actually, this is your signature, I think, Shadows. Yeah. But as part of this, there were a lot of questions asked about, we're encapsulating these bioluminescent algae into this material. Ethically, what's going on here? And so through kind of, various design experiments and just really starting to kind of, just reflect on it very deeply. So one of the things was, writing a kind of a microbial job description, asking these algae to work free of charge and only return for sunlight. And it's a very abstract thing to do, but it kind of frames what you're asking of these organisms. But one of the things that's really interesting is that, the idea, of creating this bioluminescent living textile, when I presented it in Europe to the Francis Crick Institute or whoever it might have been, they thought I was completely nuts. But when I presented it to the community in French Polynesia, they were totally open and accepting of it. And people are very, very surprised of that, but it's actually very deeply rooted in French Polynesian culture, because they come from kind of a voyaging background, traveling thousands of miles across the ocean. And when you're voyaging, the way you find your direction is from the stars, and the stars only come out at night. So they have a very deeply rooted belief that it's in the unknown, it's in the darkness that you find your direction. And so when it came to kind of proposing these really future concepts, these communities that were so deep rooted in traditional knowledge actually were incredibly open-minded to it. And one of the other things that was really interesting was their understanding and their perception around what life is. And their knowledge is, they exchange knowledge orally, very little information is written down. And while for us that's kind of incredibly scary, we want to preserve something, we want to archive it into on paper. They think about this very differently. And if you've seen the film Moana is all about this legend of Maui and Te Fiti. And this doesn't come across, particularly in the film Moana, but actually the real meanings behind that is that it's this belief that the best way to preserve something is to keep it alive, not to let it kind of stagnate and go old. And so this idea of kind of livingness and life, not only as, a materiality, living materials can adapt and react and respond and heal, which is, really special, but actually that's, more of a design philosophy, that it's a way of preserving something, that it's a way of keeping something alive. And so for me, this state of livingness was a really interesting thing to reflect on and to think about. And I particularly fell in love, when I was looking at different definitions of life, was actually the definition from Schrödinger, the physicist of cat in the box fame, which, while this isn't the most technically correct definition of life, he defined life as anything which defies equilibrium. So life is anything which can push against entropy, which can push against this kind of slow progression of our universe towards disorder. Living things, the only things that can go and create structure, that can go and create beauty from this order and from this chaos. And I found that not only wonderful in terms of being in awe of life and living things, but also you're always an obligation as a human to think about, okay, what structure am I going to go and create? What beauty can I go and build as a living thing? And so livingness was really the obsession that I developed from that. It culminated in this. So Iris van Herpen, the Dutch fashion designer, she saw the work that I've been doing, and she asked, if there was any way that we could work together to create a garment. And so we only had about just over 2 months to make this happen. But we managed to transfer that technology that we developed in Tahiti into a full living garment that was able to walk out on the runway. So here you can see it being taken off the mannequin, and you can see the algae all kind of triggering and illuminating response to the movement of the garment. And so this was really special to be able to take something from a very niche project to something which generated a huge amount of impact, and again to kind of really be challenged to scale up this living material and to make it work in such a high pressure environment. So this was at Paris Haute Couture Week last year, and yeah, it was a huge success. It was a really special moment to see it out there and see it alive. And this was how we had developed it. It was developed in collaboration with the University of Amsterdam. So obviously to scale up the process, we really needed a lot of space, a lot of facilities. And so the University of Amsterdam very kindly gave us their spaces, let us kind of take over their lab for a couple of months. And that was how we managed to eventually find a way to scale up the process and take this idea into a full-scale garment. And it got a lot of attention. And for me, the attention was great, but the really special thing about all of the press that it got was the diversity. So not only was it covered in Vogue, but it was also covered in Nature. It was also covered in the New York Times. And for me, it kind of just shows how powerful working with living things can be, because it's so interdisciplinary and it's so engaging for so many different communities that I think, for me, this is such a really special thing about working in the field of biodesign. I'm very quickly going to touch on another project. And I think this is really important because I just want to bring everything back down to earth, because the living materials that we're creating, they're lovely, but the world doesn't need bioluminescent textiles. Shortly after that project, Speedo contacted me and they said, how many kilometers can we order of this fabric? And obviously, they completely missed the point of the project. They were talking about scale. They wanted to scale it up. They wanted to make bioluminescent swimsuits. And this work is it's somewhere in like the 2040s. Maybe in 15, 20 years' time, we might be able to start using living materials at scale. But that's not going to change the impact today. And the reason today is really important is because these are our emissions, and every one of these is one of the times that our kind of societies come together and agree that we need to dramatically reduce our emissions. And as you can see, nothing has changed. Our emissions are still rising. And yet everyone is committed to halve our emissions by 2030 and reach zero emissions by 2050. Now, if I look at this chart, there's nothing about that says it's possible. But I'd like to try and contribute to it. And so how can we do living materials on kind of a day-to-day basis? Well, this is a project that I'm working on at the moment in Berkshire in the UK. And living materials have been used as bridges for a very long time. In horticulture, living materials are used a lot. And this is something that we want to try and make living material as functional in our day-to-day lives. But still, this is a far way from a one-off piece in the countryside of the UK. Is a far way from really having a significant impact globally. And so, for me, when we look at scale, how can we really scale up biomaterials? Well, on here, we've got MycoWorks. They're a mycelium leather company, and they're really starting to scale up mycelium leather. And this is amazing that people are starting to talk at scale. But for me, the real issue comes the fact that they've built this huge factory in South Carolina. And actually, how is this different from a traditional material? Where are they getting the ingredients from? How are they sourcing them? How are they producing them? And actually, if we start to think about scale in terms of factories and production, we're going to start falling into the same traps we fell into before. Whereas for me, this is the local bakery where I live in Annecy. And for me, this is biotechnology at scale. There are 28 million baguettes baked every single day in France, and they're baked in over 50,000 bakeries distributed all over the country. And for me, that is how biology works. Biology isn't designed to scale. Biology is designed to be these unique individual units working separately. And so for me, the bakery model is so much better than the factory model. And where is this kind of most prevalent? Well, yeah, the food industry, I think, is fascinating. Does anyone kind of take a guess at the lifetime impact, the life cycle impact of these two things, a shoe or a hamburger? Does anyone know which would have the greater life cycle impact? They're about the same. They're somewhere, depending on what it is, it's between 5 or 10 kilos of CO2. And it's funny because, we might obsess over buying a sustainable pair of shoes and think, a sustainable pair of shoes is the coolest thing ever. But then actually, we'll just go out and eat a burger for lunch without even thinking about it. And I think, sometimes it's really useful to put it into perspective of, the number of millions of dollars that are got into footwear sustainability innovation, when every single day we just go out and eat things without even thinking about it. And so to kind of ground what I'm doing, I have a project which is focused on the very near future. Because for me, this is only, relevant if we can, make things happen now. And so I have a project called Yanaa. Yanaa is trying to be a project which is scaling living materials now. And it all comes from this kind of weird comparison that one day I was shopping for sports nutrition in the business, and kind of energy gels give me energy when running. And then I was also shopping for dishwasher tablets. I realized that the marketing that we put on them was almost identical. We essentially saw our human body like a machine. It was about energy, it was about efficiency. And actually, when you look at the tradition of food, like what foods did people have when they were voyaging, these huge distances, when we were a nomadic population? And actually, they were fermented beans, they were sweet potatoes, it was pinole by the Mexican kind of running populations. And actually, real foods have fueled our populations forever. And this is the most remarkable living material. If we're talking about living materials at scale, it's fermented foods. Those are the most kind of common living materials that are all around us every single day being produced at scale. So I want to translate the thinking around livingness and really start to explore the industry of food as a way to grow that. So we're not machines, we're not dishwashers. And it's interesting, there's, the world of sports. I used to be an athlete, so it's something kind of I'm a little bit aware of, but it's a really great example of, reductionist thinking. If you've seen the film Rocky, this is reductionist thinking to more ecological thinking, because actually our human body is this really complex system. We're not just us, we've got our microbiome, we've got so many processes going on, we've got our psychology. And yet people seem to kind of think that, if I put energy in, I get energy out. Food is calories, but actually, calories are measured by burning something. And there's absolutely nothing in our bodies that burns a food to get to see how much energy comes out of it. And so this is the kind of the product that we've made. It's a product for athletes. It's made entirely from real foods. It's cooked in the south of France, and it's based on pulses and legumes. So pulses are a really remarkable crop. They are incredibly good for soil health, and they help put structure back into the soil. They also help to kind of fertilize the soil by fixing nitrogen in there. So we've got these incredible crops, the lentils that you see here and the chickpeas, and they're incredibly good for soil health, but also they're incredibly good for living materials as well. And they allow us to kind of ferment the material to improve their availability. And so what we've done is we've created these real food products as a provocation against this ultra-processed, sterile industry of sports nutrition. And that's kind of what I'm focused on launching at the moment. And now, rather than making one garment, this here as well is, you can see how it's being made. We're working with an amazing little factory in the south of France. But this here, this isn't a one-off garment that walks down the runway at Paris Haute Couture Week. This is now going out to tens of thousands of people. And these tens of thousands of people are eating, consuming living materials. And this is how I think we can kind of try translate the far future biodesign that I'm also working on into the everyday lives of people, and at scale to try and have the kind of, try and have a significant impact. Still adopting the exact same principles as the other work I'm doing. So this principle of being a bioregional business. So every single one of our ingredients comes from the south of France. We know every single ingredient that's come from. We know who's made them. We know where they're growing. And that allows us to then work with people to kind of understand that in the same way that we worked deeply with the local community in French Polynesia. And obviously, for the biodesign nerds in here, there's a huge amount of interesting stuff we can do with food, whether it's looking at different fermentation processes to improve the nutrition, or whether it's looking at some of the prototypes we've done for edible packagings and how we can kind of transform the imperfect solution that we've made so far into something that's more advanced and evolving. And I think what I've concluded about kind of business is this: it's this trade-off between when sports we've got this trade-off between human health and human performance, where athletes are trying to optimize themselves and they be sacrificing their health. And it's exactly the same with business, where we're trying to optimize a business's performance. We're trying to be commercially successful. We're trying to survive, while also we're trying to exploit our planet. And we've got this kind of really weird thing where we're trying to exploit something, but we're also trying to maximize it as well. And we live in this kind of world of trade-offs where businesses are constantly trying to exploit, but to profit, to try and make this, seesaw a little bit more balanced if we can. And I think the key to sustainable kind of business innovation is actually to see it differently, and actually to look at it and say, how can we create value from what we're doing? And when you look at the dress that we've made, the dress is just a load of seawater in a suit. It's really uninteresting and unglamorous. The food that we're making, it's basically just a speed hummus. But when you wrap it up in meaning, when you give it a narrative, when you give it a design, when you give it an aesthetic, that's suddenly what designers can do. We can find all the little details and we can turn it into something incredibly valuable. And when you stop thinking about value allows you to make more from less. You can find more details. You can make something more valuable with just the same amount of resources going in. And that is our superpower, I think, as designers, is in finding those little details. And so the project Yanaa, it is just a sweet on us. But the name Yanaa is essentially you are not an astronaut. And it's so interesting because, again, through creativity, we've managed to kind of create this kind of movement of athletes who are trying to, not be an astronaut. They're trying to not eat space food. They're trying to not be too serious. And they're trying to kind of explore planet Earth with the same curiosity and wonder that someone would go and explore another planet. And so whether it's the far future or whether it's, very day to day, for me, it's our creativity as designers that allows us to go and create value and make something really impactful for the smallest possible impact.